It is just after 3 in the morning on March 13th, 1964, and Kitty Genovese is walking home from work. She has just finished her shift at Ev's 11th Hour bar in Hollis, Queens, where she tends bar most nights. She parks her red Fiat on Austin Street, about 100 feet from the front door of her apartment building at 8270 Austin Street. The distance is nothing. She has walked it dozens of times. The neighborhood is quiet. The lampposts cast orange pools on the sidewalk. Inside the building, residents are asleep. In the windows above, a few lights are on. She is almost home. She does not make it home. A man named Winston Mosley has been circling the neighborhood in his car, looking for someone to attack. He has done this before. He will later confess to police with a matter-of-factness that will disturb the detectives interviewing him, describing his methodology the way a person might describe a grocery run. He sees Kitty. He parks. He follows her. She sees him coming and begins to run. He catches her 30 feet from a call box and stabs her twice in the back. She screams. Her screams are loud enough to wake neighbors in the apartments above. A light goes on across the street. A man named Robert Moser leans out his window and shouts down, "Leave that girl alone." Mosley looks up at the window. He walks back to his car. Kitty Genovese is bleeding on the sidewalk. She tries to get up. She makes it to the side of the building and collapses in a doorway. Upstairs, Robert Moser closes his window and goes back to bed. Mosley waits 10 minutes in his car. Then he gets out, walks back to where Kitty Genovese is lying, and stabs her again. She screams again. More lights go on. No one comes down. No one calls the police. Not yet. Mosley sexually assaults her as she is dying. He leaves. She dies in the doorway. The call to police does not come until 3:50 in the morning, more than half an hour after the first attack. The officer arrives in 2 minutes. The police estimate that 38 people heard or witnessed some portion of what happened that night. 38. And here is the question this story has been building toward, the question that is aimed directly at you, not at the neighbors in those apartments, not at the detectives, not at Robert Moser who yelled once and closed his window. The question is this: if you had been in one of those apartments, if you had heard those screams, if you had looked out your window and seen what was happening below, are you certain, not hopeful, not reasonably confident, but genuinely certain that you would have been the one who called? Because the data says you should not be certain at all. And it is exactly these kinds of questions, the ones that expose the machinery beneath our self-image, that the human code exists to answer. The story of what happened on Austin Street did not stay in Queens. It moved, the way certain events do, into the offices of researchers and scientists and psychologists who read the newspaper account in the days that followed and felt something shift inside them. The New York Times ran the story with a headline that would become one of the most quoted in the history of American journalism. 37 who saw murder didn't call the police. The number was later corrected and the details were later disputed, but at the time of publication that headline landed in the breakfast rooms and faculty lounges of a country trying to understand what had happened to its cities, its communities, its people. Two social psychologists in particular could not let it go. John Darley was 30 years old and teaching at New York University. He had come to psychology through an interest in moral behavior, what people actually do when the stakes are real, rather than what they say they would do, which is a very different question. Bibb Latané was 31. At Columbia, more empirically oriented, a researcher who believed that human behavior could be measured and mapped with the same rigor applied to any other natural phenomenon. They knew each other. They had conversations. And in the months following the Genovese killing, those conversations turned toward a single nagging problem. The popular explanation for what happened on Austin Street was moral decay, urban alienation, the coldness of city life. New Yorkers, the editorial suggested, had become so isolated from one another, so deadened by the pace of modern existence, that basic human compassion had been extinguished. The neighbors who heard Kitty Genovese die were, the implication ran, simply bad people. Darley did not believe this, not because he had particular faith in the goodness of New Yorkers, but because the explanation felt too simple, too comfortable, too convenient. If the bystanders were simply bad people, then the rest of us were safe. We were different. We would have called. The moral failure was located elsewhere, in other people, in a city we could hold at arm's length. Darley thought, what if the failure is structural? What if it is something that can happen to anyone, under specific circumstances, regardless of character? This is what made him dangerous as a researcher. He was willing to follow the question wherever it went, even if it went somewhere nobody wanted to arrive. In 1968, Darley and Latane designed an experiment that has since become one of the most replicated and most unsettling findings in the history of social psychology. The setup was simple, almost elegant in its simplicity. They recruited college students for what they described as a study about the personal problems of urban university life. Each student was placed alone in a small room and told they would have a conversation with other participants via an intercom system. This, they were told, was to ensure anonymity and avoid embarrassment when discussing personal struggles. The student would speak through the intercom. They would hear other voices respond. What they did not know was that the other voices were tape recordings. There were no other participants. The entire network of voices was pre-recorded. The student was always alone. In the first condition of the experiment, the student believed they were speaking one-on-one with one other person. In the second condition, they believed 3 people were on the network. In the third, 6. That was the only variable. How many people the participant believed were listening? The conversation began normally. Then, one of the recorded voices, apparently another participant, began to have what sounded like a seizure. The voice reported having a condition related to epilepsy and that stress sometimes brought on attacks. Then, in the middle of a subsequent speaking turn, the voice became strained and disjointed. The person appeared to be in serious distress. He said he could feel an attack coming on. Then his speech became thick and garbled. He said he was going to die. And then the voice went quiet. The experiment was measuring one thing. Would the real participant leave the room to get help? The results arrived with a slowness that Darley and Latane themselves described as deeply uncomfortable to watch unfold in real time. In the 2-person condition, when the participant believed they were the only other person who could hear what was happening, 85% of participants left the room to seek help within 60 seconds. In the 6-person condition, when participants believed 5 other people had also heard the apparent emergency, only 31% responded within that same window. The presence of other people, people who could not be seen, people who could not be contacted, people who were not even real, reduced the rate of helping by more than half. Latane and Darley called what they had found the bystander effect. The more witnesses to an emergency they proposed, the less likely any individual witness would be to help. The mechanism was not indifference. The mechanism was not cruelty. The mechanism was something far more ordinary and far more difficult to defend against. It was diffusion of responsibility. The unconscious automatic sense that when many people are present, the burden of action is distributed among them, and each individual's share becomes small enough to feel optional. But there was a second mechanism, one that the researchers found in follow-up work, and that is in some ways more disturbing than the first. They called it pluralistic ignorance. When an ambiguous event occurs, a scream that could be a fight or a game, a slumped figure that could be unconscious or drunk, a sound that could be a car backfiring or something else, people look to others around them for cues about how to interpret it. If the others appear calm, the natural conclusion is that there is no emergency. If the others appear calm because they themselves are looking to others for cues, everyone ends up confirming everyone else's inaction in a silent, circular loop of mutual misinterpretation. The 38 witnesses to Kitty Genovese's death were not, most of them, watching the attack and consciously deciding not to call. Most of them heard something, looked out, saw other windows with no one calling out, and concluded, if it were a real emergency, someone else would be doing something. No one was doing anything, so perhaps it was not a real emergency. The very absence of action in others became the evidence that action was unnecessary. This finding landed in the scientific literature like a stone in still water, and the ripples have not stopped since. It was replicated in parks, in shopping malls, on city streets, in office buildings, in online forums. In every context, researchers could design and test, the effect held. It scaled across age, gender, education, geography, and stated values. People who described themselves as highly civic-minded, people who said they would absolutely help in an emergency, showed the effect just as clearly as everyone else. The intention was not the variable. The situation was the variable. It was around this point in their research program, roughly a year into the data collection, while they were still running variations of the original paradigm, that something happened to Darley that he later wrote about in a way that is worth pausing on. He had spent months engineering situations in which people failed to help, and he was good at it. He could predict with considerable accuracy what percentage of participants would leave the room based on how many voices they believed were on the network. The effect was stable and replicable and publishable. He was a scientist with a clean result. And then one afternoon, he realized that he could also predict his own behavior, that he was not outside the data, that the same mechanisms he had spent a year documenting in his participants were mechanisms that lived in him too, undiminished by his knowledge of them. Knowing that the bystander effect was real did not, as far as he could tell, reliably override it. He could understand the phenomenon completely and still be subject to it. The awareness and the susceptibility coexisted without canceling each other out. He published a paper that addressed this directly. It is not widely read outside the field, but it is, in some ways, the most honest thing he wrote. The bystander research created a problem for the broader culture when it arrived, because it collided with a narrative Americans were in the middle of constructing about the Kitty Genovese case. By 1968, the story had calcified into a moral fable. The 38 witnesses were symbols of urban callousness. They had been condemned in newspapers from pulpits and living rooms across the country. They were the cautionary tale, and into that condemnation, Darley and Latane arrived with data suggesting that the condemnation was, if not wrong, profoundly incomplete, that any of the people doing the condemning would likely have behaved similarly under the same circumstances. This is not a comfortable finding to present to a culture mid-condemnation. The researchers were careful in how they framed it. They were not exonerating the bystanders. They were not saying that nothing wrong had happened. They were saying that what had happened was a function of the situation, not exclusively of the character of the individuals. And they were saying that the situation could be reproduced reliably in any college in the country, with students who were not in any meaningful way different from any of us. Now there is something you are probably not expecting to learn at this point in the story. The number 38, the number that has anchored the Kitty Genovese case in the cultural memory for more than 60 years, is almost certainly wrong. In 2007, a researcher named Joseph Demay conducted an exhaustive re-examination of the original police records, the physical layout of the block, and the available witness statements. What he found was that the geography of Austin Street made it nearly impossible for most residents to have seen the first attack at all. The attack happened around a corner. Most of the apartments did not have lines of sight to either location. The initial New York Times report, written by a reporter named Martin Gansberg, under pressure to meet a deadline, and guided by a police commissioner named Michael Murphy, who was, by several accounts, using the case to argue for increased police funding, substantially overstated both the number of witnesses and the certainty of their observation. Demay estimated that the true number of people who clearly saw or heard the attacks and understood them as attacks was closer to a dozen, possibly fewer. Some witnesses genuinely did not understand what they had heard. Several called out or took partial action. One woman, Sophie Farrar, actually came to Kitty's side while she was dying, held her, and was with her when she died. The corrected account changes nothing about Kitty Genovese's death. She died on that sidewalk just the same. But it changes something about the story we have been using to process her death for 60 years. The 38 indifferent witnesses, the monolithic symbol of urban cruelty, was at least partly a journalistic construction. The real event was more chaotic, more ambiguous, more human, which is to say both worse and more forgivable than the myth. What the myth got right was the mechanism. Even if only 12 people heard those screams clearly, the bystander effect still applies. It applies with 2 witnesses and 4. The number that matters is not 38. The number that matters is more than 1. If you have reached this point in the video and you are feeling unsettled in a way that feels important, that feeling is the point. Subscribing to the human code means the next time we go somewhere like this, you will be there. By the mid-1970s, the bystander research had moved beyond the laboratory and into the field, and the findings had accumulated into something that researchers in adjacent disciplines were beginning to take seriously. Social workers and emergency responders noticed that bystander failures in real emergencies followed the same geometry as in the lab: crowded platforms, busy intersections, the corridors of hospitals. Sociologists began mapping the effect onto large-scale institutional failures, asking whether the logic of diffuse responsibility could explain not just sidewalk non-intervention, but the failure of organizations to respond to evidence of wrongdoing. Teachers who knew about abuse, employees who knew about fraud, officers who knew about misconduct. The answer was yes. With some modifications, the bystander effect scaled. But the researchers who followed Darley and Latane into this territory also found something else. A variable that Darley and Latane had initially underweighted because their original design could not easily capture it. The variable was relationship. The bystander effect, it turned out, was substantially weaker when people knew each other. When witnesses to an emergency had any prior connection to either the victim or to each other, response rates climbed sharply. A study conducted at a community pool in 1977 found that when an apparent drowning occurred in a pool where most patrons were regulars who knew one another, intervention time dropped to an average of 22 seconds. In a comparable pool with mostly strangers, the average was over 4 minutes. Community was not just a social nicety. Community was, in emergency terms, a life-saving mechanism. Anonymity was not just loneliness. Anonymity was, in emergency terms, a risk factor. This finding has been replicated in various forms many times since. It has survived into the age of social media, where researchers have found versions of the bystander effect operating in comment sections in group chats and online forums, and where, interestingly, the relationship variable holds in a modified form. People who know a poster personally or who feel genuine community with them are more likely to intervene when that person posts something that suggests distress. There is a detail about Bibbs Latane that does not appear in most accounts of this research, but that is relevant to understanding the full weight of what he and Darley were doing. Latane had, at an earlier point in his career, studied social facilitation, the phenomenon by which the presence of others improves performance on well-learned tasks. People run faster with an audience. People work harder when watched. He had spent years documenting the ways in which the presence of others increases arousal, motivation, engagement. Other people, in his earlier work, made you better. Then he spent the next decade documenting all the ways in which the presence of others made you worse. Less responsive, less likely to act in a moral emergency. The two bodies of work sit beside each other in his publication history in a way that, if you read them in sequence, produces a particular kind of cognitive vertigo. Other people amplify, other people inhibit. Both things are true. The human being in a crowd is simultaneously more energized and less morally reliable than the human being alone. He understood, better than almost anyone, that there is no simple story about what other people do to us. Let us turn now to the question of what was actually happening inside the brains of those 38 witnesses, or the 12, or however many there actually were. Because the bystander effect is not a failure of caring. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand, and the most counterintuitive. When researchers have measured physiological responses in bystander experiments, tracking heart rate, galvanic skin response, stress hormone levels, they consistently find that bystanders in multi-witness conditions are more physiologically aroused than bystanders in single-witness conditions. They are more stressed. They are more activated. They are in many cases showing clear signs of distress. They are not unmoved. They are moved and paralyzed simultaneously. The neuroscience of this involves several systems working at cross purposes. The amygdala processes the threat signal and generates the emotional response. The horror, the distress, the sense that something is wrong. That response is real and fast, happening in milliseconds. But the prefrontal cortex, which governs decision-making, risk assessment, and social behavior, is simultaneously receiving a very different signal from the social environment. Other people are not acting. Other people's inaction is, evolutionarily, a powerful signal that the perceived threat is not as serious as it appears. The prey animal that bolts when the rest of the herd is still grazing usually turns out to be overreacting. The herd knows something. Safety in numbers is a mechanism, and it runs in both directions. The group can protect you from a predator, and the group's calm can convince you there is no predator even when there is one. The brain that fails to call for help in a crowd is not a broken brain. It is a brain running a program that was adaptive on the savannah and catastrophic on a street in Queens at 3 in the morning. The software is not malfunctioning. The software is simply running in a context it was not designed for. Understanding this is important not because it removes responsibility from the bystanders. Responsibility is not negated by mechanism, but because it changes what we do with the information. If the problem is character, the solution is finding better people. If the problem is a predictable feature of human cognition under specific social conditions, the solution is changing the conditions. Darley and Latane spent the later part of their careers working on exactly this. What they found was that the bystander effect has a specific vulnerability. It breaks down when individuals are singled out. When a person in an emergency crowd makes eye contact with a specific bystander and says, "You, in the blue jacket, please call 911, the diffusion of responsibility collapses. The ambiguity about who should act is removed. The specific person can no longer share their responsibility with an anonymous group because they have been identified, individuated, called into the situation by name or description. Response rates in this condition jump to over 90%. This is why first aid and CPR training programs now teach this as an explicit skill. When you need help in an emergency, do not shout for help in general. Find a specific person. Point at them. Say, "You, call an ambulance now." The research has been translated directly into practice, and lives have been saved by that translation. But there is something uncomfortable in this solution, which is that it works precisely because it overrides the social mechanism that created the problem in the first place. You have to know that the mechanism exists in order to circumvent it. The training converts bystanders into people who understand why their instincts under these conditions are unreliable and who have a substitute protocol ready to deploy. It is not a cure, it is a patch. Now consider for a moment a related phenomenon that Darley explored in the last decade of his career, one that extends the logic of the bystander effect into territory that most people find even more disturbing because it is harder to keep at a safe distance. He called it moral disengagement from organizational structures. He was interested in how individuals within large institutions, corporations, governments, militaries, religious organizations, come to participate in or fail to prevent serious harm not because they are malevolent, but because the structure of their situation has distributed moral responsibility so finely across so many people that no individual ever feels the full weight of what their collective behavior is producing. The soldier who files a report, the manager who signs a document, the assistant who makes a call, the compliance officer who receives a memo. None of them, considered individually, did anything that felt wrong. Each of them performed a small, bounded, apparently ordinary task. The harm emerged from the sequence, not from any individual act. And when investigators later asked these individuals what they had been thinking, the answer was almost always the same. They had assumed that someone above them, or beside them, or later in the chain, would catch anything that needed catching. They had diffused their moral responsibility into the organization just as automatically and unconsciously as the neighbors on Austin Street diffused theirs into the night air. This is not a metaphor. This is the same mechanism. It scales. Darley spent the last years of his career trying to understand whether educational intervention could alter the scaling. whether teaching people about the bystander effect and its organizational variance would, in practice, make them more likely to resist. The findings were mixed at best. Knowledge helped somewhat under some conditions for some people, but the effect never went away entirely. Even people who had been trained, who understood the mechanisms, who had discussed the research at length and could explain it fluently, even they showed substantial rates of diffused responsibility under novel, high-pressure conditions. The research that most disturbed him personally, he later said, was a study he ran in the late 1980s with a group of medical students who had been given extensive training in ethical decision-making and in the dynamics of institutional pressure. The students were placed in a simulated clinical setting and exposed to a series of situations in which a senior authority figure gave instructions that were subtly but clearly inappropriate. The students who had been trained in the relevant research were not significantly more likely to resist the authority figure than students who had received no training at all. He sat with that finding for a long time. He said so in a late interview that was not widely circulated. He said he had spent his career producing research he hoped would be useful, and that he was no longer sure it was useful in the way he had hoped. The knowledge produced by the research did not translate as cleanly into changed behavior as he had wanted it to. He was not giving up. He was being honest. There is a difference. And this brings us to the section of this story that is addressed to you directly, and it is delivered gently because the gentleness is not courtesy. It is precision. Courtesy softens things. The gentleness here is because the truth being described does not need amplification. If you have been watching this video and thinking, as many viewers of this material do, that you understand the bystander effect well enough to not be subject to it, that the knowledge provides a kind of inoculation, that your awareness of the mechanism creates a gap between you and those 38 or 12 or however many neighbors, there is a study you should know about. In 1999, two researchers named David Dunning and Justin Kruger published work that would become famous under their names, documenting the phenomenon by which individuals with limited knowledge in a given domain tend to substantially overestimate their competence. This is the finding that has been popularly summarized, imprecisely but not entirely inaccurately, as the tendency of the least competent people to be the most confident. But there is a less discussed inverse finding in the same body of research. The people who most overestimated their resistance to cognitive and social biases were the people who had learned just enough about those biases to feel informed. A little knowledge, in other words, does not correct for the bias. A little knowledge can actually increase the overestimation. The researchers who studied bystander effect resistance over the years found a specific and particularly uncomfortable version of this. In multiple studies, participants who were told about the bystander effect before being placed in a simulated emergency did show somewhat higher intervention rates than naive controls, a modest but real effect of the training. But participants who were most confident before the experiment that the training had prepared them to resist, those participants showed no reliable advantage over the naive controls. Their confidence was not predictive of their performance, it was inversely predictive. The people who said, with certainty, "I would have called," those were the people the data tracked most carefully. It does not mean you would not have called. It means your certainty that you would have called is not evidence that you would have. The certainty is generated by a different system than the one that would have made the call. The certainty lives in the self-concept. The call would have required overriding the social mechanism in real time, under pressure, without preparation, in the dark of 3 in the morning with other windows closed and quiet around you. Those are different things. There is a particular cruelty in the way the Kitty Genovese story has been used in the decades since, and it is worth naming. The story has been deployed consistently and repeatedly as a parable about other people's failure. Urban people, modern people, alienated, atomized people who have lost the communal instincts that would have saved a woman's life in some earlier and better time. The story has been used to make people feel superior to the witnesses, and to feel frightened of a kind of social decay they locate in their neighbors, their cities, their era. What the research produced is something different and considerably less comfortable. It produced evidence that the failure on Austin Street was not a failure of a particular class of people at a particular moment in history. It was a failure of a mechanism that every human being carries that can be activated by specific social conditions. And that has nothing in particular to do with the urban environment of 1964, except that the urban environment happened to provide the specific conditions, anonymity, plurality, ambiguity, that trigger it most reliably. You carry this mechanism not as a defect, as standard equipment. What changes when you know this is not your susceptibility, which does not substantially diminish? What changes is your relationship to the moments in your own life when the conditions for this mechanism are present. The meeting where no one speaks up about the thing everyone knows, the comment section where something is clearly wrong and everyone is watching, the hallway where a sound comes from behind a door and you keep walking because you assume someone else will check. These are the moments the research was built for, not as retrospective condemnation of the people on Austin Street, but as a map of the territory inside you, so that when you arrive at those moments, and you will arrive at them, you are arriving with more information than the people who preceded you. There is one more thing to say about Kitty Genovese herself, which is that the way her story has been told has, for 6 decades, done something to her as a person that she did not deserve. She has been converted almost entirely into a symbol, into the victim in a parable. Her name has become shorthand for a social phenomenon, and in becoming shorthand, it has, in some ways, ceased to be her name. Her name was Catherine Susan Genovese. She was 28 years old. She had grown up in Brooklyn, moved to Queens, and managed the bar where she worked with what her coworkers later described as a kind of warm efficiency. She played softball. She had a partner, a woman named Mary Ann Zalanko, who drove to the hospital when she got the call, and who sat in the waiting room not yet knowing that Kitty had died in the doorway of a building that was 30 feet from home. Mary Ann Zalanko gave almost no interviews in the decades that followed. In one of the few she did give to a documentarian working 60 years after the murder, she said that she still thought about what Kitty had looked like walking out the door that night, and that she had never, not once, stopped thinking about it. That is the actual weight of what happened on Austin Street. Not the abstraction, not the statistic, not the number, whether it is 12 or 38. A woman who was almost home, and someone who loved her, who has spent 60 years not stopping thinking about it. The research is real, and it matters, and you should know it. And knowing it should not come at the cost of knowing that. The human tendency to convert particular suffering into universal principle is itself a form of distancing. A very quiet, very respectable cousin of closing the window and going back to bed. Darley died in 2018 at 81. He is described by his colleagues as a person who is genuinely persistently troubled by what his research had revealed. Not in a performative way, not in the way of a scientist who wears the weight of their findings as a kind of intellectual credential, but in the quieter and more ordinary way of a person who learned something about the world that he could not unlearn and that never stopped costing him something. He continued to work. He continued to publish. He continued to design studies and train students and argue in the literature and attend conferences. He did the work. He just did it without the comfort of believing the work had solved the problem. He did it because the alternative was doing nothing, and he understood, better than anyone, what doing nothing looked like. Latane is still alive as of this writing in his late 80s, and he has largely moved away from the bystander work in his public statements, focusing on later work in social physics and the dynamics of opinion spread in social networks. He rarely speaks about the original studies in interviews. When he does, he speaks carefully and with precision, describing the methodology in terms that are more measured than the cultural mythology that has grown up around the work. He seems to prefer that the work be understood accurately, rather than dramatically. Both of them, in their different ways, seem to have arrived at a similar place. The work tells you something true, and it does not release you from anything. What we're left with, after 60 years of research building on a murder on a Queens sidewalk, is something both simpler and harder than a lesson. It is not a lesson. Lessons have endpoints. You learn the lesson, you apply the lesson, you move forward presumably improved. This is not that. This is a piece of knowledge about how human beings function under specific conditions that does not resolve into guidance, because the guidance, while real and useful and worth knowing, does not fully address the mechanism. You can be trained to call a specific person in a crowd rather than shouting in general. You can be trained to name the bystander effect in the moment and use the naming as a lever. You can cultivate community so that anonymity, the condition that makes diffusion of responsibility most potent, is less present in your life. These things help. The research supports them. They are worth doing. And after all of that, the mechanism remains. Quieter, perhaps, less likely to fully capture you, but present, threaded into the social architecture of human cognition built from millions of years of evolutionary pressure that valued the herd's judgment over the individuals, that made the lone dissenter the most dangerous thing in the clearing, that wired you to look at the people around you and take their stillness as information about whether the threat is real. You are a social animal of a very particular kind. The same wiring that makes you capable of the deepest forms of human connection, the love that endures 60 years of grief, the friendship that crosses the room in a crisis, the community that builds the world, is the wiring that under specific conditions converts the presence of other people from a resource into a barrier. The connection and the paralysis run on the same circuit. Knowing this is not supposed to make you despair. It is not supposed to make you trust yourself less in some general and debilitating way. It is supposed to give you the specific knowledge that in the specific conditions, crowds, ambiguity, anonymity, the quiet of other people not acting, your instincts are running a program that was not designed for the present moment. You are not broken in those moments. You are just very old, in the way that all human beings are very old, carrying forward hardware from an environment that no longer exists. What becomes possible when you know this is not certainty that you will do better? It is the possibility of a different relationship to the hesitation itself, the moment when the condition is present and the paralysis begins to form. If you know what it is, you have a chance of naming it in real time rather than after the fact. You have a chance of choosing past it, not guaranteed, not reliably, but a chance. Kitty Genovese did not get that chance. She needed someone to make that choice, and the conditions conspired, as conditions sometimes do, against the choice being made. The research that followed does not redeem that. Nothing redeems that. The research describes it, traces its mechanism, maps its terrain, and hands the map forward. What you do with the map is the only remaining question. There is something that stays with people who spend time with this research. Something that does not show up in the data, and that is hard to articulate without sounding like you have strayed from the territory of science into something else. It is the particular texture of what it feels like to know that the moral emergency you imagine yourself handling well is the one you are least prepared to evaluate your own performance on. That the self who imagines responding is not the self who will respond. That there is a gap between the two selves that the research can describe but cannot close. Most people at some point in their lives have been on one side or the other of an emergency and known afterwards that they behaved differently than they would have predicted, either worse, failing to speak, failing to move, watching the window close from inside themselves and being unable to stop it, or better, finding themselves already in motion before any decision had consciously been made, already at the door, already on the phone, already across the room. The latter cases are less studied because they do not fit the narrative of the bystander effect, but they exist. People do intervene. People do override the mechanism. What is interesting about those cases, when researchers have tried to trace them, is that the overrides are almost never the result of a conscious decision made in real time. They are almost always the result of a prior decision, a commitment made in advance, often long in advance, often in a different context entirely, that collapsed the distance between impulse and action. People who had a history of volunteering, who had made helping part of their identity before they were ever in an emergency, who had practiced the behavior of intervention in small ways until it became something closer to a reflex than a choice. The mechanism that saves you is not the awareness. The awareness helps. The mechanism that saves you is the practice. The small choices before the moment arrives that make the large choice less of a choice and more of a continuation. Sophie Farrar crossed the lobby of her building in Queens at 3 in the morning and held a dying woman she barely knew. She was 5 feet tall and weighed under 100 pounds, and she did not know if the attacker was still nearby. She crossed the lobby anyway. When researchers tried, years later, to fit her into one explanatory framework or another, she said she was not sure why she did it. She said she just did it. The just did it is the part the research cannot fully reach. The just did it is where the science hands the question back to something older and less mappable. It is where the data ends and the person begins. We have been sitting with this question for 60 years now, since a reporter named Martin Gansberg got the number wrong and set off one of the most consequential research programs in the history of psychology. We know more about what we are than we did before. We know more about the conditions that make us fail and the conditions that make us act. We have the map. The question the data has been building toward, the one this entire account has been circling, is also the simplest one, and the most personal, and the only one that the research leaves genuinely open. The last time you were in a situation where something was wrong and other people around you were doing nothing, what did you do? And what story did you tell yourself afterwards about why you did it?